And to everyone who hates when I win, the winged victory came to the Louvre in pieces, and people still line up to see her. And I can only hope that despite my flaws, and despite my cracks and my breaks, and there are many of them, that at every premiere and everything I do, people will wait in line to see.
Yeah, not this time, Rachel. Hi, my name is Sydney. Welcome back to hell. And as per usual, before we launch in, today's video is sponsored by Qualia. And of course, by me and my company, Lions Tea Exchange. I am currently running an up to 40% off sale on the website as a celebration for 1 million subscribers on this channel. So a big thank you to everyone who has supported me all this time. So take advantage and grab yourself some tea. I promise you won't regret it because my blends are delicious. I will link everything in the description box. Thank you very much. And before we get started, you guys are starting now to ask me basically in every video what these screensavers are behind me. They're not actually screensavers, they're just videos that I have from YouTube that I let play in the background because I think they look nice. But because there's no specific website that I'm getting them from, I will just link the video that I use in my video in the description box, and then you guys can do with that what you will. So I actually feel like I'm a little late to this party because since Snow White came out on March 21st, absolutely everybody has made a video about it. But yours truly, your favorite funny talking Australian, decided to drag her feet, but better late than never, I guess. Because coincidentally, on Friday the 21st, I too went to see the remake of Snow White, and boy, oh boy, did I have a lot of fun. I actually just ended up being a sad older lady just sitting in the cinema all on her lonesome, shoveling handfuls of popcorn into her face. Yes, I did invite a friend and buy her a ticket, but she conveniently couldn't make it. So rude. Anyway, since its release, the 2025 Snow White film has continued to dominate discussion all over the internet. People have been pointing out how few people are in movie theaters. I actually posted my own little clip showing how empty mine was, and that popped off on X, hilariously. Look at this nice email from the Daily Mail asking if they could use my video. So nice, so considerate of them. Since its release, more and more information has come out about the film's performance, with some outlets suggesting this is close to the worst performing live-action Disney adaptation ever. And the reviews are looking worse and worse by the day, and frankly, that's just putting it mildly. And just a reminder, Disney spent $270 million on this film. On what? I couldn't tell you. At the same time, even more clips of Rachel Zegler are doing the rounds, basically adding even more fuel to this absolute dumpster fire. Now, I've weighed in on Snow White a couple of times over the last little while, and because there are plenty of people who have done actual recaps and full-blown reviews of the film, I won't be doing that in this video. But because I went ahead and spent $12 whole to see this movie, I thought that I too would weigh in my own Sydney way. This video is also obviously going to have spoilers, so if you do intend on seeing Snow White, I don't know, I guess watch this at your own peril. Obviously, I didn't go into this with particularly high hopes, but this movie actually turned out to be a lot worse than I imagined. I found that nobody did a good acting job across the board. The narrator sounds like he might burst into tears at any moment. The musical numbers were disruptive. The weird CGI throughout the movie looks goofy and out of place. And instead of a Snow White who comes off as empowering and inspiring as the writers probably hoped she would, she instead seems entitled and annoying. Very on brand for Rachel Zegler.
Weird.
So of course, that's what we're going to talk about today. And there is a lot to criticize about this movie, but you know, my normal disclaimers, I'm not going to get to everything by any stretch of the imagination. And in an effort to not go over too much old ground with relation to the historical context of this film generally, but also all of the conflict and drama surrounding it, I will link videos that I have previously made about this in the description box, and you can watch them in your own time. So with all of that said, and before you once again board my hell gondola, and together we curl up into little balls of sadness in the fetal position at the bottom of the boat together like roly-poly worms, let's hear from today's sponsor, Qualia. I don't like feeling icky, and I bet neither do you. Oh no, that is my least favorite thing to feel. I don't love brain fog, low energy, or being sold snake oil that smells bad and tastes even worse. I'm looking at you, green powders. In today's world, it's hard to know what will actually optimize your wellness. But boy oh boy do I have a brand for you. Qualia. Qualia is a fantastic wellness brand focused on helping people optimize their health to the highest level. Through carefully crafted and scientifically backed supplements and formulas, Qualia's products help with things like mental clarity, better aging, and supporting detoxification, just to name a few. The reason I personally really like this brand is because they've conducted pilot studies and double-blind placebo-controlled clinical trials on many of their products, all while keeping each formula vegan, non-GMO, gluten-free, and backed with a 100-day refund guarantee. I've newly started taking the Qualia Senolytic, which helps the body naturally eliminate senescent cells, which also are known as zombie cells. Cells that cause symptoms like aches and pains, slow workout recovery, and brain fog. Even in the short space of time that I've been taking it, I have noticed a big impact on how I feel. It's a bit hard to put into words, but I just feel a general sense of betterment. So if you too want to check out a range of truly inspired health formulas, then click the link in the description or go to qualialife.com/Sydney. And don't forget to use code Sydney at checkout for up to 15% off your purchase. So right out of the gate, it's important for you all to understand that Disney didn't remake Snow White. They made two different films, mashed them together, and called it Snow White. And I say this for two primary reasons. The first is that, although this film attempted to keep the original plot points, such as the evil queen attempting to kill Snow White, the dwarves finding her in their beds and then becoming close to her, the evil queen poisoning her with an apple, and Snow White being awoken by true love's kiss, it also created a parallel storyline where Snow White meets a bunch of bandits, falls in love with one of them, and tries to fight the queen to take back her kingdom. The story swaps back and forth between a very boring retelling of the original and a drama-filled revolutionary takeover of the kingdom. And all of this takes place in 1 hour and 49 minutes, leaving very little room for depth and any degree of decent storytelling. Which honestly is a bit sad, because what I personally loved about the animated film was how much it focused on Snow White and her relationship with the dwarves, fully exploring lots of themes in a way that didn't feel forced or rushed. The second reason for my assessment here is because early on, the film introduces what I can best describe as socialist-y type themes. It goes out of its way to tell us that Snow White's parents ruled their kingdom with fairness, sharing the bounty of the land with those who tended to it. When Snow White's parents died and the kingdom was taken over by the evil queen, Snow White's stepmother, she turns the farmers into soldiers and uses a spooky threat at the kingdom's southern border to scare everybody and then hoard their wealth. It's actually sort of comical in this movie how many jewels these townspeople apparently seem to have. I guess this is the version of socialism I am constantly told hasn't been tried yet. Some of the language around this is so direct that it feels like it got pulled right out of the Communist Manifesto. This fairly blunt political messaging is awkwardly woven throughout what should have been a regular, enjoyable fairy tale about a girl and a bunch of dwarves, but instead, We're partially given a story about equity and how taxing people too much makes the background dreary. As most of you know by now, I am of the belief that there is always room for studios to expand storytelling when it is appropriate. But in the case of Snow White, the additions to the narrative not only didn't make a lot of sense, but they felt very inappropriate for this specific story. Unlike some of the other Disney princesses like Mulan or Belle, Snow White was never supposed to be some independent, freedom-fighting girl boss. Her depiction was one of innocence, purity, and a beauty that shines very brightly from within. Our 1937 Snow White is endeared to us because of her gentleness, generosity, and trusting nature. It also causes those around her to act protectively, which is crucial to the storyline. But those endearing traits also serve as a very obvious flaw that others seek to exploit. And although the original animation was short, it still was packed with meaning and moral. The 2025 adaptation, on the other hand, wrapped all of this up with cannonballs and threw it into the ocean.
You strapped a cannon to bootstraps.
And this brings me to one of the biggest issues I have with this movie. In order to make all of the aforementioned plot additions and themes make sense, this movie needed to massacre Snow White's personality, and instead reimagine her as a girl boss, a revolutionary figure who could save her kingdom. If you guys can cast your minds back to Rachel Zegler's interview in 2022, she wasn't joking when she said that this movie is about Snow White becoming a leader.
I just mean that it's no longer 1937, and we absolutely wrote a Snow White that is
not going to be saved by the prince.
She's not going to be saved by the prince, and she's not going to be dreaming about true love. She's dreaming about becoming the leader she knows she can be, and the leader that her late father told her that she could be if she was fearless, fair, brave, and true.
Yeah, I mean, Snow White is the girl you remember, but she's definitely made for the modern age, and there's such an emphasis on what it really means to be the fairest of them all. And for Snow White, it's coming to terms with finding herself and finding her inner voice and finding a sense of agency so that she can be a just ruler and a wonderful queen.
The problem is that the writers seemingly couldn't fully commit to this murder. So instead of an empowered feminist girl boss, we are given a Frankenstein monster of a character who spends most of the film oscillating between looking doe-eyed and jutting out her bottom jaw in an effort to look innocent, while doing things that scream exactly the opposite, like riding in on a horse to save her love interest, repeatedly confronting the evil queen, and letting herself waltz into the dwarves' home for no good reason. The thing is, the movie is pretty heavy-handed about telling us that Snow White is trying to be more fearless and brave, as her father told her to be. But throughout the entire movie, there's never really a moment where you feel that Snow White is actually in need of anyone's protection or help. But the film wanted to maintain this air of innocence and purity, which makes her entire personality feel extremely inconsistent and confusing. One of the moments that really irritated me personally early on is when Snow White finds her love interest, Jonathan the Bandit, stealing potatoes from the castle. Yes, they eliminated the prince and replaced him with Jonathan, who coincidentally is the only person in this entire movie who actually has a consistent character and can apparently act, so you know, there's that. Do with that what you will. Anyway, she confronts him, he explains that the people are starving, and Snow says that she'll talk to the queen about it because maybe the queen isn't aware that this is happening. This honestly just comes off as extremely dumb, and potentially Snow White is extremely dumb because she sees this woman all dripped out in jewels and is basically like, oh, maybe she doesn't know that the people are, like, starving to death. Okay.
It's just, Your Majesty, people are struggling.
The whole thing comes off as absurd and disingenuous, and maybe it's because Rachel Zegler is not a good actress, but this line felt especially stupid.
I feel they need some kindness.
Another notable example of this weird, conflicted personality is when the huntsman takes Snow White into the apple orchard to kill her at the evil queen's behest. Good catch there, you. Yes, they did in fact race swap him. Actually, this whole German town is very diverse. lots of communism and multiculturalism. Hollywood's favorite. In the original, Snow White is terrified and shields her face during this confrontation. In the remake, she defiantly asks, why? In both films, the huntsman fails to murder her and supposedly does so for the same reason, her purity and kindness. But in the original, the huntsman watches her sweetly pick flowers and help a lost baby bird. In the remake, he's swayed because Snow White gives him an apple. I am probably just being needlessly nitpicky here, but I'm not so sure that someone giving someone else an apple that first person could have just picked from this orchard themselves is really a good enough reason to abandon this quest that your queen has sent you on to murder the second person. I don't know. I guess an apple a day keeps the murderous huntsman away. No, Australians, not the spider. I suppose another annoying thing about this scene is that 1937 Snow White was genuinely shocked to learn that her stepmother, the evil queen, wanted her dead. 2025 Snow White just doesn't seem surprised. Again, like I said, this character is totally ridiculous. She is full of contradictions and, at least in my opinion, deeply unlikable and makes no sense. So, all in all, we have a character who, one moment, is attempting to be quiet and naive, and the next she's fighting with bandits in the forest and being quippy with Jonathan.
I told you I'd fight with you.
You continue to impress me.
I'm not afraid to fight.
And the thing is, if Disney wanted a rebellious girl boss princess, that's fine, I suppose. But this wasn't the film to do it with. You don't market an entire movie as a remake and then massacre the personality of the protagonist. I want to reiterate this because I think it's important, but once again, the 1937 Snow White's entire storyline is centered around her purity, her innocence, her generosity, her goodness, in a world that is very unfair to her. And it is because of her kindness and selflessness that she is eventually accepted and protected by the dwarves and the woodland creatures, who, by the way, play a really big role in the movie, but don't play a big role in this 2025 remake. It is also the reason that the huntsman risked his own life to save hers. It's why the prince, who was so taken with her beautiful singing, goes out of his way to find her and eventually rescue her. There's obviously a lot more to say about this and a lot of moments of weirdness in this movie, but given I've only seen it once and in theaters, I can't remember them all. I'm sorry. So this brings me to the second major thing I really disliked about this film: Snow White and her interactions with the dwarves. In the original movie, the relationship that develops between Snow White and the dwarves is a key component to the entire story. However, in this version, the dwarves are treated as background characters who don't play that much of a meaningful role. And yes, let's just acknowledge for a moment how upsetting they look, except, I don't know, I think, like, Dopey is a little cute, you know, with his little baby face. Maybe I need an exorcism, who knows. There's definitely a whole conversation to be had here about Disney's choice to CGI these guys instead of just casting dwarf actors, but we don't have time to get into that. I also just want to take a moment to correct the record and say that the 7 average people who were apparently meant to be the dwarves are in fact part of Jonathan's bandit group. Whether or not they actually started off as dwarves and then became this instead with reshoots, I don't know. I have to assume that's not the case, but yeah, I just want to set that record straight because there was a lot of confusion around that. I don't know if this makes things any better, but it is certainly funny when you consider that here we have the only real dwarf in the film, so once again, do with that what you will. Now, as I've said in other videos, I am a big fan of the relationship between Snow and the dwarves, and I believe they are extremely important to this narrative. Not only do they serve to further the events of the story, but they also work in a sort of symbiotic way with Snow White. But this remake almost makes them feel like an afterthought. Yes, they are part of the storyline, and yes, the film tried to keep their key moments, but with the parallel events about saving the kingdom and yada yada, they could have been removed entirely and nothing would have really changed. In the animated film, after Snow White escapes from the huntsman through the forest, she happens upon woodland creatures and asks if they know somewhere that she can sleep. They lead her to the dwarf's house, where she hesitantly knocks on the door and eventually enters, asking if she can come in. Our 2025 Snow White just waltzes right in, asks if anyone's home, and then goes to sleep in beds upstairs. In the 1937 original, we have an entire setup take place where Snow sees how messy the house is, how small the furniture is, and deduces that 7 orphans must live there. Feeling sad for them, as she too is an orphan, she decides to clean the house, hoping it'll be enough for them to agree to let her stay. This cleaning scene does come back around, but it's Snow White teaching the dwarves to basically clean up after themselves, which I don't necessarily have a problem with, but I think it removes some of the thoughtfulness and consideration that we saw playing out in the original, and probably only adds to the 2025 Snow White character seeming to be very entitled and bossy. Because the original animation focused predominantly on Snow White and her relationship with the dwarves, we got to see them interact a lot more. Because the 2025 version needed to focus on multiple other plot points, we got such little time between Snow and the dwarves that their relationship was never really properly established, and their reasons for teaming up were pretty flimsy, making the dwarves feel sort of unnecessary. And for me, once again, this is really sad, because as I've mentioned in other videos, one of the things that is really missed here that takes place in the original film is Snow's relationship with Grumpy, which I personally really love. I'm not sure how many people realize, but Grumpy actually plays a central role in this story. He doesn't like Snow White from the outset, and he sort of exists as the contrast to her happiness and kindness. But in spite of this, she sets about winning him over, praying for him, caring for him, kissing him goodbye as he goes off to work, and eventually this starts to melt the ice around his heart, and he begins to love her as much as the other dwarves. When she is visited by the crone who gives her the poisoned apple, Snow is in the middle of baking Grumpy a pie. And when the dwarves find out that Snow White is dead, it is Grumpy who leads the charge to find her. It is Grumpy who chases the crone off the cliff and basically risks his life trying to climb up all these rocks after her, and eventually, she falls off and dies. And it is Grumpy who places his flowers last and on her hands at Snow White's funeral. The dwarves even place her in a glass coffin because they can't bear to bury her, and we get absolutely none of this in the remake. The writers subbed out Grumpy for Dopey, having Snow White focus her attention on bringing him out of his shell by teaching him to whistle and eventually kind of eliminating his mutism. So yeah, Dopey talks now. But as far as Grumpy goes, he's more of a side character rather than anything else. When Snow White dies, sure, Grumpy cries, but there's absolutely no context as to why he's sad. He basically goes from disliking her to crying over her, but the writers cut every moment from the original that might explain this behavior, and it makes the whole thing feel completely inorganic and hollow. Not to mention, Snow White basically dies in the middle of the film, which to me sort of means that the meaningfulness of this plot device is kind of lost. It's like, there's 40 minutes left in the movie. We know she lives. What do you think we're gonna do for the next 40 minutes? They also just shoved her on some random rock, which, okay, I mean, yeah, that's a choice, but there's nothing inherently sad about this. To be honest with you all, this entire sequence feels like something that the writers probably would have turfed completely, were it not for the fact that it was a very central part of the original movie. But the way that it plays out in the remake makes it seem like they were more so just ticking the boxes of what to include from the original, rather than putting effort into creating an emotional, meaningful scene. Wow, I basically just summarized the vibe of the entire movie. Sometimes I'm just dazzled by my own intellect. All of this brings me to my last point, and one that I've actually beaten you guys up with in other videos. Not every film needs to be modernized, and in this case, I walked away from this movie with a distinct feeling that this didn't need to be made at all. I feel like that usually for a bunch of reasons. Animation allows for brighter, bigger storytelling, it is so much more fun to watch, and we can suspend our disbelief a lot more. But with Snow White, there's something more to this. As I've explained in other content, the original Snow White was absolutely a product of its time and was extremely impactful for both Disney as a company and the people who were watching it towards the end of the Great Depression. I won't rehash why for the sake of brevity, but if you are interested to learn why, I will link a couple of videos in the description box where I go into this in much greater detail. But for now, suffice it to say that Snow White's design, its characters, its morals and meanings, all of this made sense to that specific audience at that specific time. And it's part of why the animation was such an enormous success for Disney despite all the naysayers calling it Disney's folly. But given the direction of Hollywood and Disney at present, I don't think they could have ever retold this story in a way that did it justice while maintaining the narrative's original meaning. We know that Disney's remakes are usually a bit of a soulless cash grab, but I think the reason this one is the worst of all is because it was meant to be an uplifting narrative for the people of 1930s America. The themes of Snow White were very much a product of their time, like I just mentioned, but if you aren't willing to commit to those themes, you can't tell this story, which is kind of evidenced by the fact that Disney simply couldn't retell the story shot for shot like they did with the 2019 Lion King, a film that at least stayed true to the original story despite its obvious flaws. It's evidenced further by the fact that they couldn't build on this story in a way that enhanced it for their modern audience. When you combine elements from two completely opposing character archetypes, you get a big, confusing mess that doesn't know what it wants to be, which I guess has become a disease plaguing modern entertainment, sadly enough. The bottom line is that Disney didn't modernize Snow White to honor the story. Otherwise, they would have retained more elements that added to the narrative instead of this weird rebellion plotline that stole the entire focus of the film. They were particularly lazy because of the distraction the revolution component provided. This was the only thing that really pushes the plot forward. They also relied heavily upon the audience knowing the original relationships between characters, so they didn't put any real effort into developing them in this adaptation. This also super detracts from the movie itself, since the relationships, how they're developed, and how they changed the characters affected every single aspect of the original film. If you aren't honoring the story or the characters, what's the point? Other than destroying our collective childhood experiences, that is. Considering too that people are pretty burnt out on the strong female lead archetype, this would have been a great opportunity to deliver something familiar that also offered a breath of fresh air in comparison to the gritty, headstrong young woman we often see in leading roles today. Snow White, despite the fact that she is a product of 1930s America, still resonates with plenty of women. Her love story with the prince still resonates with plenty of people. They didn't need to go in and change these components in order to modernize it. They could have simply left it as is. Importantly, and I don't think that this can be overstated, there is still more than one way to be a woman after all. Ultimately, I think we all knew that this film was always going to fall flat on its face. Disney doesn't remake these films because it loves them and it wants to retell the story to a new generation. It does it because money. And the sad result of this is that it sucks all of the enchantment and the magic out of the narrative. And this film is absolutely no exception to that. And as far as Disney remakes go, at least in my opinion, this one is uniquely terrible. I guess an additional sad reality to this is that I'm not so sure that Disney's going to learn its lesson. And to be honest with you all, I actually think that they're going to keep squeezing the money out of their existing IP until we end up with the Lion King 1.5 remake. You know, when they're really scraping the bottom of the barrel. In the end, I really wish that Disney had just left Snow White alone. Because the reality is that the original animation is a classic and beloved for a very good reason. It didn't need to be updated, and it really didn't need to be retold. And the film that we've ended up with, this retelling, this remake, this adaptation, will probably be of greater enjoyment to people who don't like it than children and other people who were just hoping to experience some Disney magic. Now, on that very happy and pleasant note, and before I open the floor to all of you, this is just a reminder to check out Qualia using the link in the description. I am very hesitant to work with pill brands or health brands, but I have actually noticed a big difference using Qualia, and I really like what they stand for, so go and check them out. If it's something you're interested in, maybe give them a try. Now, I open the floor to all of you. What do you all think? Are you on my side of the fence where you've seen this movie and you really didn't like it? You thought it was confused and muddled and Rachel Zegler wasn't very good in it? Did you see it and you really liked it? You thought that it was a good story, or at least you thought that maybe all the drama around it has been blown out of proportion? Are you someone who's never going to see it because you don't want to give your money to Disney, but more importantly, you just want to get all of your news about it from videos like this and commentators and whatnot? What do you think of all of the conflict and drama and issues around the film? Is it deserved? Is it not deserved? Should this story have been retold in the first place? And what do you generally make of this issue overall? As always, if you have made it this far in the video, congratulations. I always like having you along for the full ride. If you are new here and you are not subscribed already and you would like to see more of me and more of this kind of content, feel free to subscribe to the channel, as well as leaving this video a like and a comment, because I do read the majority of them and I do like hearing your feedback. As always, I hope you wonderful pretty people stay safe and well and always make good choices, and I will see your wonderful faces in the next video.